Entitled Billionaire dates a broke cashier. Her secret stuns his entire family. Ethan Carter lounged in his leather chair, the soft hum of conversation around him fading into the background. The charity gala was as glamorous as always, glittering chandeliers, tuxedos, and gowns flowing like water. He had attended countless events like this, and the novelty had long since worn off. These gatherings were more about networking than charity, a fact he had long accepted. "Mr. Carter," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see his assistant, Rebecca, standing at his side with her tablet in hand. "The press wants a quick comment before the night ends." Ethan sighed, brushing an invisible speck of lint from his jacket. "Of course they do. Let's get it over with." He followed her to the corner of the room, where a small group of journalists waited. He plastered on his most charming smile and delivered a polished statement about the importance of giving back to the community. It was the same speech he had given a dozen times before, and it always did the trick. The reporters scribbled in their notepads, thanked him, and moved on. As the evening wound down, Ethan slipped away from the main hall, seeking a moment of quiet. He wandered into a small side room set up as a break area for the event staff. The stark contrast to the opulence outside caught his attention. Folding chairs, styrofoam cups of coffee, and the faint scent of cleaning supplies. That's when he saw her. She was standing near the coffee machine, her back to him. Her uniform, a simple black shirt and slacks, marked her as one of the event staff, but there was something about her that made him pause. She moved with a quiet grace, her movements deliberate and unhurried. When she turned around, their eyes met. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but not deferential. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by her directness. Most people, especially those in her position, wouldn't dare speak to him that way. He hesitated, unsure of what he was even doing there. "I didn't expect anyone else to be here." "It's a break room," she said simply, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "People come here to take breaks." Her response was so matter-of-fact that Ethan found himself at a loss for words. Finally, he said, "Do you know who I am?" She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Should I?" The corner of Ethan's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "I'm Ethan Carter." "Congratulations," she said, taking a sip of her coffee. He couldn't tell if she was serious or mocking him. "And you are?" "Ella Parker," she replied. "I'm just here to make sure you and your guests have a lovely evening." Her tone was neutral, but there was a subtle edge to her words that intrigued him. "Well, Ella Parker, you certainly know how to make an impression." "I could say the same about you," she said, setting her cup down. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Ethan watched as she walked away, her head held high. For the first time in a long time, someone had left him speechless. The next day, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the brief exchange. It wasn't like him to dwell on such things. He was used to commanding attention, not chasing after it. But there was something about Ella that stuck with him. She wasn't impressed by his name, his wealth, or his power. She treated him like just another person, and he couldn't decide if he found it refreshing or infuriating. He did what he always did when something puzzled him. He dug deeper. A quick search of the event staff roster revealed her address, a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood. It was a far cry from the world Ethan inhabited, and he couldn't imagine what it would be like to live there. He decided to see for himself. Ethan's car pulled up outside the small coffee shop where Ella worked her day job. He stepped inside, the door jingling softly behind him. The place was quaint, with mismatched furniture and a chalkboard menu. Ella was behind a counter, taking orders with the same calm efficiency he had seen the night before. When she saw him, her eyes narrowed slightly. "You're a long way from the gala." "I was in the neighborhood," Ethan said, which was a blatant lie. Ella folded her arms, unimpressed. "What do you want, Mr. Carter?" Ethan hesitated, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to being questioned like this. "I wanted to apologize for last night. I think I might have been a bit rude." Ella raised an eyebrow. "You think?" Her bluntness caught him off guard again. "All right, I was rude. I'm sorry." She studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether to believe him. Finally, she said, "Apology accepted." "Anything else?" Ethan hesitated again. He had come here on a whim, but now that he was standing in front of her, he realized he didn't have a plan. "How about a coffee?" Ella smirked. "That's not how this works. You're the customer. You pay, I make the coffee." Ethan couldn't help but smile. "Fair enough. I'll take whatever you recommend." Ella nodded and got to work, her movements quick and precise. When she handed him the cup, she said, "That'll be $5. Ethan pulled out his wallet, handing her a crisp 50. "Keep the change." Ella's smirk returned. "Nice try. We don't accept tips over $10. Ethan chuckled, handing her a 10 instead. "You're not making this easy for me." "It's not my job to make things easy for you," she replied, her tone light but firm. Ethan left the coffee shop feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, challenged. And he liked it. Ethan couldn't get Ella out of his head. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. She wasn't intimidated by his wealth or impressed by his charm. In fact, she seemed completely immune to everything he usually relied on to win people over. For someone like Ethan, who thrived on control, it was both infuriating and exhilarating. The next week, he found himself back at the coffee shop. Ella was behind the counter again, her focus on the line of customers. Ethan waited his turn, ignoring the curious glances from the other patrons who clearly recognized him. When it was finally his turn, Ella looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "Back again. Can't stay away," Ethan said with a small grin. "I'll have whatever you recommend." Ella sighed, but there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "You're consistent, I'll give you that." She handed him a cup of coffee a few moments later, and this time he took a seat at one of the mismatched tables. He watched as Ella moved through her shift, her efficiency and calm demeanor never wavering, even during the busiest moments. When her break came, she surprised him by sitting across from him, her own cup of coffee in hand. "All right," she said, leaning back in her chair. "What's your deal?" "My deal," Ethan repeated, caught off guard. "You keep showing up here, Mr. Carter," Ella said, "and I can't figure out why a guy like you would bother with a place like this, or someone like me." Ethan hesitated, uncharacteristically unsure of himself. "Maybe I like the coffee." Ella raised an eyebrow. "Try again." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. Maybe I like you." Ella blinked, her composure momentarily slipping. "Why?" "Because you're different," Ethan said honestly. "You don't treat me like everyone else does. You're refreshing." Ella looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, "I'm not sure whether to be flattered or suspicious." "Why not both?" Ethan said with a small smile. Ella shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Ella fell into an unlikely rhythm. He continued to visit the coffee shop, and their conversations grew longer and more personal. Ethan learned that Ella was working 2 jobs to make ends meet, saving every penny she could to support her dream of opening her own bakery someday. She spoke about it with a mix of hope and practicality, her determination shining through. In return, Ethan shared pieces of his own life, how he had inherited his father's company and spent years building it into an empire, but also how hollow it sometimes felt. He spoke about the pressure to live up to his family's expectations and the constant scrutiny that came with his wealth. "You're not what I expected," Ella said one afternoon as they sat together on her break. "What did you expect?" Ethan asked. Ella shrugged. "Someone shallow, arrogant, someone who wouldn't look twice at a cashier." Ethan winced. "I can't say I blame you for thinking that. I wasn't exactly charming the first time we met." Ella smirked. "No, you weren't." They both laughed, and for a moment, the differences between their worlds seemed to fade away. But not everyone was pleased with their growing connection. Word had gotten back to Ethan's mother, Margaret Carter, about his visits to the coffee shop and his apparent interest in a woman who didn't fit their social circle. Margaret was the epitome of high society, her every move calculated to maintain the family's image. She wasn't about to let her son's infatuation jeopardize their reputation. "We need to talk," Margaret said one evening, cornering Ethan in the family's sprawling mansion. "Let me guess," Ethan said, pouring himself a drink. "You've heard about Ella." "Of course I have," Margaret said sharply. "And I'm telling you, it needs to stop." "Why?" Ethan asked, his tone challenging. "Because she doesn't come from money? Because she doesn't belong in our world," Margaret said. "She's using you, Ethan. Can't you see that?" Ethan set his glass down with more force than necessary. "She's not using me. She doesn't care about my money, or this world. That's what she wants you to think," Margaret said. "But mark my words, she'll ruin you." Ethan stared at his mother, anger and disbelief swirling inside him. "You don't know her. And neither do you," Margaret shot back. "You're blinded by whatever it is you think you feel for her. But trust me, Ethan, this will end badly." Ethan left the conversation feeling more determined than ever to prove his mother wrong. But Margaret's words had planted a seed of doubt. It wasn't long before those doubts began to take root. The tension from his mother's warning lingered in Ethan's mind, but it only fueled his determination to see Ella. If anything, it deepened his resolve to prove that his feelings were genuine and that Ella was different from what his mother had assumed. He decided not to bring up the confrontation with Ella. It felt like a problem he needed to solve on his own. Ethan's visits to the coffee shop became more frequent, and their conversations ventured into deeper territory. Ella shared stories from her childhood, how she grew up in a close-knit family that fell apart when financial troubles hit. She recounted the nights she spent dreaming of building something of her own, even as she worked long hours to keep herself afloat. Ethan listened intently, surprised at how much he admired her resilience. It made him realize how insulated his life had been, surrounded by luxury and privilege, but devoid of the kind of strength Ella seemed to embody. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Ella asked one afternoon, her chin resting on her hand as they sat at a corner table. "Tired of what?" Ethan asked. "The wealth, the attention, the constant pressure to be Ethan Carter, billionaire." Her tone was curious rather than judgmental. Ethan hesitated, swirling the coffee in his cup. "More than I'd like to admit. It's like everyone expects me to play a role, but no one ever asks if I want to." "And do you?" Ella pressed. "Want to play the role?" Ethan looked at her, her steady gaze challenging him to answer honestly. "I don't know. Sometimes I think I'd trade it all just to be normal." Ella smiled faintly. "Trust me, normal isn't always as great as it sounds." "Maybe not," Ethan said, "but it's real. And lately, that feels like something I'm missing." Ethan's world, however, didn't stop pressing against him. His mother, relentless in her disapproval, escalated her efforts. She hired a private investigator to dig into Ella's background, convinced that the cashier was hiding something. When the report came back, Margaret was stunned by what she found. Armed with this new information, Margaret arranged for Ella to come to the Carter estate under the guise of a casual dinner. Ethan was initially thrilled when Ella agreed, seeing it as a step toward integrating her into his life. Ella, while nervous, decided to attend, knowing how much it meant to him. The dinner was everything Ella feared it would be. Margaret greeted her with a saccharine smile, masking the disdain in her eyes. The table was set with an intimidating array of silverware, and the conversation felt like a minefield of carefully worded judgments. Margaret wasted no time before steering the conversation toward Ella's life. "So, Ella," she began, her tone overly pleasant, "tell us more about your background. Where did you grow up?" Ella shifted uncomfortably, but answered with composure. "I grew up in a small town. My parents worked hard to give me and my siblings everything they could. And what do they do now?" Margaret pressed. "My father passed away a few years ago," Ella said softly, "and my mother is retired." "I'm sorry to hear that," Margaret said, though her tone lacked genuine sympathy. "And before you worked at the coffee shop?" "I've had a few jobs here and there," Ella replied, "mostly to make ends meet." Margaret nodded, her smile sharpening. "Interesting. I imagine it must be quite a change from your earlier life." Ethan frowned, sensing the undertone in his mother's words. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Oh, nothing," Margaret said breezily. "I just mean that some people have colorful pasts." Ella's posture stiffened, but she didn't rise to the bait. "Everyone has a past, Mrs. Carter. It's what you do with the present that matters." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't push further, at least not yet. After dinner, Ethan found Ella in the garden, her arms crossed as she stared out at the manicured hedges. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "That was harder than it should have been." Ella let out a small laugh, though it lacked humor. "Your mother doesn't like me. She's not even trying to hide it." "She doesn't know you," Ethan said, his tone defensive. Ella turned to face him, her expression tired but resolute. "Do you?" The question caught Ethan off guard. "What do you mean?" "You think you know me," Ella said. "But there are things I haven't told you. Things I'm not proud of." Ethan's heart sank. "Ella, whatever it is, it doesn't matter to me." "It will," she said softly. "When the truth comes out, it will." Ethan stared at Ella, her words hanging heavy in the air. He wanted to press her, to demand she tell him everything right then and there. but something in her eyes stopped him. There was pain there, an ache that told him this was a battle she wasn't ready to fight. Not yet. All right, he said, his voice gentle. When you're ready. Ella's shoulders relaxed slightly, her gaze softening. Thank you. The ride back to her apartment was quiet. Ethan could feel the tension between them, but he didn't push. As he dropped her off, he said, I meant what I said, Ella. Whatever it is, I'll be here. She nodded, giving him a small smile before disappearing into her building. Ethan sat in the car for a moment, staring after her, his mind racing with possibilities. What could she be hiding that she thought might drive him away? And why did he feel like it wouldn't matter, no matter how big or small? The next morning, Ethan's world grew even more complicated. Margaret summoned him to the mansion, her tone sharp and commanding as always. When he arrived, she was sitting in the grand living room, a folder resting on her lap. Sit, she said, her expression unreadable. Ethan frowned but complied, his patience already wearing thin. What's this about? Margaret handed him the folder. This is about your little friend. Ethan hesitated before opening it. Inside were pages of information, documents, photos, and reports. As he skimmed through them, his stomach sank. Ella's past was laid bare in stark detail. Her father had been a wealthy businessman, but his empire had crumbled in the wake of a massive fraud scandal. The fallout had destroyed their family's reputation and left them penniless. Ethan looked up, his heart pounding. You dug into her past? Someone had to, Margaret said coldly. And now you know the truth. This doesn't change anything, Ethan said firmly. Her father's mistakes aren't her fault. Margaret's lips curled into a faint smile. Maybe not. But don't you see? She's hiding who she is. What else hasn't she told you? Ethan slammed the folder shut and stood, his anger bubbling over. You had no right to do this. I have every right to protect this family, Margaret shot back. You're blind, Ethan. She's playing you. She's not playing me, Ethan said, his voice rising. She's the most honest person I've ever met. Margaret stood as well, her expression hardening. Then why didn't she tell you the truth? Ethan didn't have an answer. He turned on his heel and stormed out, the folder still clutched in his hand. That evening, Ethan showed up at Ella's apartment unannounced. She opened the door, surprised to see him. Ethan, what's wrong? He hesitated, the folder feeling heavier in his hand than it should have. We need to talk. Ella stepped aside to let him in, closing the door behind him. What's going on? Ethan took a deep breath and handed her the folder. My mother, she found this. Ella froze, her eyes scanning the cover before she opened it. As she flipped through the pages, her expression shifted from shock to resignation. When she looked up at him, there was no anger, only sadness. So now you know, she said quietly. I know what your father did, Ethan said, but I don't care about that. What I care about is why you didn't tell me. Ella sat down, the folder resting on her lap. Because it's not just about what he did. It's about what it did to me. To my family. Ethan sat beside her, his gaze unwavering. Then tell me. I want to understand. Ella hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the folder. When everything fell apart, my father went to prison. My mother, she couldn't handle the shame. We lost everything, our home, our friends, even our dignity. I was just a teenager, but I had to grow up fast. I had to find a way to survive. You've done more than survive, Ethan said softly. You've rebuilt your life. Barely, Ella said, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. I still wake up every day, wondering if it's enough. If I'll ever be enough. Ethan reached out, covering her hand with his. You are enough, Ella. More than enough. Ella looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. You say that now, but what about your family? Your mother already hates me. My family doesn't get to decide how I feel, Ethan said firmly, and I'm not going to let them push you away. Ella searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt. When she found none, she let out a shaky breath. This isn't going to be easy. Nothing worth having ever is, Ethan said with a small smile. The days that followed were a test of both Ethan and Ella's resilience. Ethan's relationship with his mother became even more strained, her disapproval seeping into every interaction. Margaret wasn't used to being defied, and Ethan's decision to stand by Ella only fueled her determination to end the relationship. Ethan, however, refused to back down. He made it clear to his family that Ella wasn't going anywhere, no matter how much they disapproved. His siblings were less vocal, but clearly torn between loyalty to their mother and admiration for Ethan's newfound conviction. Ella, meanwhile, struggled with the fallout of her secret being exposed. Though Ethan reassured her at every turn, she couldn't shake the nagging doubt that their worlds were simply too different. The weight of her past, combined with the pressure of fitting into his life, left her feeling like an outsider. One evening, as they sat together in her apartment, Ella finally voiced her fears. "What if your mother's right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan frowned, setting down his coffee. "Right about what?" "About us," Ella said. "About me. Maybe I don't belong in your world." "You belong with me," Ethan said firmly. "That's all that matters." Ella shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not that simple. I don't want to be the reason you're at odds with your family." "They'll come around," Ethan said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. "And if they don't, that's on them, not you." Ella looked at him, her expression a mix of hope and doubt. "I don't know if I can do this." "You don't have to do it alone," Ethan said, taking her hand. "We're in this together, Ella." No matter what, their resolve was soon put to the test in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Ethan's mother, unwilling to accept defeat, took her campaign against Ella to the next level. She began leaking details about Ella's past to the media, spinning the story to paint her as a manipulative gold digger. The tabloids ran with it, and within days, Ella's name and face were splashed across every gossip column and social media feed. The headlines were brutal, from heiress to barista. The real story behind Ethan Carter's new flame and scandal-ridden past, the woman who stole Ethan Carter's heart. Ella was devastated. She stopped going to work, unable to face the whispers and stares. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from reporters, former acquaintances, and even strangers who had read about her online. The world she had worked so hard to rebuild was crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Ethan was furious. He confronted his mother in her office, slamming the latest tabloid onto her desk. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he demanded. Margaret didn't even flinch. "I'm protecting you, Ethan, by destroying someone I care about." Ethan's voice was cold, his anger barely contained. "Do you even hear yourself?" "She's bad for you," Margaret said, her tone clipped. "She'll ruin your reputation, your business." "My reputation doesn't matter," Ethan interrupted. "And if you can't see how wrong this is, then I don't know what kind of person you've become." Margaret's expression hardened. "I'm doing what's best for this family." "No," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. "You're doing what's best for you, and I won't be a part of it." Ethan left the mansion feeling more resolute than ever. He knew he couldn't change his mother's mind, but he could still fight for Ella. He spent hours trying to track down the sources of the leaked information, eventually threatening legal action against the tabloids that had published the story. It was a long and grueling process, but slowly, the tide began to turn. Ella, meanwhile, found strength in the people who stood by her. Her co-workers from the coffee shop sent her messages of support, and even some of Ethan's friends reached out to defend her publicly. It wasn't enough to erase the pain, but it reminded her that she wasn't alone. One night, as Ethan sat with her in her apartment, Ella finally broke her silence. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Because I love you," Ethan said simply. Ella's breath caught. It was the first time he had said the words, and she could see the truth of them in his eyes. "Even after everything." "Especially after everything," Ethan said. "You've shown me what it means to fight for something real. And I'm not giving up on us." Ella smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and hope. "I love you too." The days that followed were some of the most difficult yet defining for both Ethan and Ella. While the media frenzy continued to rage, they leaned on each other to navigate the storm. Ethan's legal team worked tirelessly to counter the false narratives, issuing statements and reining in the worst of the accusations. Still, the damage was done, and the scrutiny showed no signs of letting up. Ella had to dig deep to find her strength. Despite her initial instinct to retreat, she realized she couldn't let others define her story. She decided to go back to work at the coffee shop, knowing that hiding would only let the gossip win. Walking through the doors that morning, she was met with murmurs and curious glances from customers. But her coworkers rallied around her, offering words of encouragement that bolstered her resolve. As she served customers with her usual calm efficiency, she overheard snippets of conversation. Some spoke with sympathy, others with skepticism. But it was one older woman who approached the counter and said, "Don't let them dim your light, dear. You're stronger than they'll ever know." That brought a tear to Ella's eye. She nodded, thanking the woman softly. In that moment, Ella realized that her strength wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. Ethan, too, found himself transformed by the ordeal. For years, he had lived in a bubble of privilege and control, but this was the first time he truly felt powerless. It was humbling, and it made him confront the parts of himself he had long ignored. He began to question not just his mother's values, but his own. One evening, he joined Ella at her apartment, carrying takeout from her favorite diner. They sat cross-legged on the floor, a coffee table between them piled with boxes of food. It was a far cry from the luxurious dinners Ethan was accustomed to, but he found it oddly comforting. "You know," Ella said between bites of fries, "this isn't exactly how I pictured my life going." Ethan smirked. "Oh? And how did you picture it?" "I don't know," Ella admitted. "I thought I'd be running my own bakery by now. Maybe have a little apartment above it with a cat that likes to sit in the window." Ethan chuckled. "That's a very specific vision." Ella shrugged, smiling. "I've always been a planner. But life doesn't seem to care much about plans, does it?" "No," Ethan said, his tone softening. "But sometimes it gives you something better." Ella looked at him, her smile fading into something more tender. "You really believe that?" "I do," Ethan said. "I mean, look at us. I never would have planned this. But now, I can't imagine it any other way." Ella's eyes glistened, but she blinked back the tears. "You're such a sap, Ethan Carter." "And you love it," he teased. Ella laughed, shaking her head. "Maybe I do." Despite the moments of joy, the challenges kept coming. Ethan's family remained staunchly opposed to his relationship with Ella, particularly his mother. Margaret doubled down on her efforts to drive a wedge between them, calling in favors from high-powered friends to pressure Ethan into ending things. But Ethan was no longer the man who let his mother dictate his life. He began to take steps to distance himself from the family business, delegating more responsibilities to his siblings and focusing instead on ventures that aligned with his newfound values. One of those ventures was a community outreach program. He and Ella began brainstorming together. Inspired by her dream of opening a bakery, they envisioned a space where people could learn baking and entrepreneurial skills, providing a path for those who had been written off by society. "This is your idea," Ethan told Ella one evening as they worked on the proposal. "You'll be the face of it." Ella hesitated. "Are you sure? I mean, what do I know about running something like this?" "You know more than you think," Ethan said. "And I'll be here every step of the way." Ella smiled, her confidence growing. "Okay, let's do it." The program launched quietly at first, but word quickly spread. People from all walks of life came to learn, share their stories, and find a sense of purpose. Ella thrived in the role, her passion and empathy shining through in everything she did. Ethan watched her with pride, knowing that this was what she was meant to do. But as the program grew, so did the backlash. Margaret and her circle of critics painted it as a publicity stunt, another attempt to clean up Ella's image. The whispers grew louder, and even some of Ethan's allies began to waver. One night, as they sat together in the quiet of Ella's apartment, she finally let her exhaustion show. "What if they're right?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "They're not," Ethan said immediately. "Ella, you've built something incredible. You've helped so many people already. Don't let their opinions take that away from you." Ella looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt. "But what if I can't handle it? What if I'm not enough?" "You are enough," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You always have been." Ella leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'll never have to find out," Ethan said, wrapping his arm around her. "We'll get through this. Together." As the days turned into weeks, Ethan and Ella found themselves diving deeper into the community outreach program. The bakery initiative quickly became a cornerstone for their efforts, drawing attention not only from those in need but also from individuals and organizations inspired by the mission. Small business owners donated supplies, local chefs volunteered their time, and the once quiet space became a hub of creativity and connection. Ella flourished in her role as the leader of the program. She worked tirelessly, teaching baking techniques and sharing her story with those who came through the doors. Her honesty about her past resonated with people who had experienced their own struggles, and she became a symbol of resilience and hope. For Ethan, watching Ella succeed was as rewarding as any business deal he had ever closed. He spent his days working behind the scenes to secure funding and partnerships, using his connections to amplify the program's reach. But despite their progress, the challenges continued to loom. Margaret, unwilling to admit defeat, launched a public relations campaign to discredit the program. She gave thinly veiled interviews to high-profile magazines, criticizing the initiative as well-intentioned but naive and claiming that it was distracting Ethan from his responsibilities within the Carter family empire. The media, ever hungry for drama, latched onto the narrative. Articles questioning the sustainability of the program and Ella's qualifications began to circulate. Social media buzzed with debates about whether the initiative was genuine or just another vanity project for the wealthy elite. Ella felt the weight of the criticism acutely. Though she tried to brush it off, the whispers and stares followed her everywhere. She threw herself into her work, determined to prove the doubters wrong, but the constant scrutiny began to take a toll. One evening, as she cleaned up the bakery space after a long day, Ethan arrived with takeout and a determined look in his eyes. "You need a break," he said, setting the bags on the counter. Ella sighed, brushing flour off her hands. "I don't have time for a break. There's too much to do." "There's always too much to do," Ethan said, his tone firm but gentle. "But you can't keep running on empty, Ella. You'll burn out." She looked at him, exhaustion etched into her face. "I just want this to work, Ethan. I need it to work." "It is working," Ethan said. "Look around you. You've already changed so many lives. Don't let a few critics take that away from you." Ella hesitated, her eyes darting around the space. The shelves were lined with baked goods made by students, each one representing someone who had taken a step toward a better future. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay, a quick break." They sat together at one of the tables, sharing the takeout and talking about the day. For a while, it felt like the rest of the world faded away, leaving just the two of them in their little bubble of warmth and light. But the moment was interrupted by the sound of Ethan's phone buzzing. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "It's my mother." Ella's shoulders tensed. "You should answer." Ethan hesitated, then swiped to decline the call. "Not tonight." "Ethan," Ella said softly. "She's your family." "She doesn't act like it," Ethan said, his frustration evident. "All she cares about is control." "Maybe," Ella said, "but walking away doesn't solve anything. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can't outrun your past or your family." Ethan studied her, her words striking a chord. "You're right," he said after a moment. "But I'm not going to let her drag you down anymore." Ella reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "We'll figure it out. Together." The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He scheduled a meeting with his mother, determined to confront her head-on. When he arrived at the mansion, Margaret greeted him with her usual air of superiority, but Ethan didn't let it intimidate him. "We need to talk," he said, his tone steady. Margaret arched an eyebrow. "About what?" "About Ella. About this family. About everything," Ethan said. "I'm tired of fighting with you, Mother. But I won't let you dictate my life anymore." Margaret's expression hardened. "This isn't about control, Ethan. It's about protecting our legacy." "No," Ethan said. "It's about you being afraid of change. But change is happening, whether you like it or not." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what if she's not who you think she is?" "She's exactly who I think she is," Ethan said firmly. "And she's more than you'll ever give her credit for." For the first time, Margaret looked uncertain. Ethan seized the moment. "You don't have to like her, but you will respect her. Because she's important to me. And if you can't do that, then I don't know what kind of relationship we can have." Margaret said nothing, her silence speaking volumes. Ethan left the mansion feeling lighter than he had in months. He didn't know if his words would change anything, but he was done letting his mother's disapproval control his life. Ethan returned to the bakery, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. He found Ella sitting at one of the tables, going over plans for the next round of workshops. She looked up as he entered, her expression softening when she saw him. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice tentative. Ethan sat across from her, reaching for her hand. "It went as well as it could. I told her the truth, about us, about what this means to me. I don't know if it'll change anything, but I had to say it." Ella's eyes filled with a mix of hope and worry. "And what did she say?" She didn't say much, Ethan admitted. But I don't need her approval, Ella. I only need you. Ella smiled, though tears glistened in her eyes. You don't make this easy, do you? I don't want easy, Ethan said. I want real. And this? What we're building? It's the most real thing I've ever had. Ella squeezed his hand, her heart full. Me too. The turning point for both of them came a few weeks later at the grand opening of a new branch of their program. The event was held in a repurposed community center, its walls lined with photos of participants and their creations. Dozens of people showed up to celebrate, including some familiar faces from Ethan's world. As Ella mingled with the crowd, sharing her story and thanking supporters, Ethan watched from the sidelines, his pride evident. She had faced so much, judgment, doubt, and her own insecurities, but here she was, shining brighter than ever. Margaret arrived unexpectedly, her presence sending a ripple of surprise through the room. Ella froze for a moment when she spotted her, but then straightened her shoulders and approached her with quiet confidence. Mrs. Carter, Ella said, her tone respectful but firm. I didn't expect to see you here. Margaret studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, she extended her hand. I may not agree with everything, but I can't deny what you've accomplished. This program is impressive. Ella hesitated, then shook her hand. Thank you. That means a lot. Margaret nodded, her gaze softening slightly. I can see why my son believes in you. Ethan, watching the exchange from a distance, felt a wave of relief. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. As the night wound down, Ethan and Ella found themselves alone in the quiet of the community center. The lights were dim, the air filled with the faint scent of freshly baked bread. Did that really just happen? Ella asked, leaning against one of the tables. It did, Ethan said, a small smile playing on his lips. I think she's finally starting to see what I've known all along. Ella laughed softly, shaking her head. I don't know how we got here. By not giving up, Ethan said, stepping closer to her. And by believing in each other. Ella looked up at him, her eyes shining. I love you, Ethan Carter. I love you too, Ethan said, pulling her into his arms. More than you'll ever know. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But Ethan and Ella knew they could face anything together. Their love had been tested and proven strong, built on a foundation of trust, resilience, and the courage to defy expectations. As they stood together in the quiet of the community center, they felt something they hadn't in a long time: peace. Their worlds, so different yet somehow perfectly aligned, had come together to create something extraordinary. And this was only the beginning.